Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Antje du Bois-Pedain, who's the Professor of Criminal Law and Philosophy at the University of Cambridge. She's also the Director of
Deputy Director.
Deputy Director for the Center of Penal Theory and Penal Ethics at the Institute of Criminology. She also happens to have been my very, very patient undergraduate dissertation supervisor. So thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Trenton, for inviting me. So I was debating what piece of work to present, and I thought this particular one, even though I actually finished this draft around January, and I haven't really had much time to go back to it since to rethink it, is probably the topic that has the widest appeal, in that it's about a question that is very much debated in contemporary philosophical literature, but but the way I came to the question was really through the problem of negligence. So the question I am exploring in this paper is what justifies the outcome responsive features of the criminal law as we have it. So usually I tend to come to a criminal law problem by thinking that the law somehow got it wrong, and I want to sort of see how it got it wrong. But here I thought, no, actually, a heck of a lot of people who I won't name in this context, who've been writing about, outcomes in the criminal law context, seem to have gotten hold of the wrong end of the stick. The law actually seems to get it right. And so I first want to summarize the features which I think the law does get right, and then, explain a little bit more about how I think these features can be defended. So the first feature is that where I think the law gets it right is that it makes outcomes relevant to liability, both in offense definitions and in terms of the amount of punishment that is received. So that is something that, as you know, a lot of authors challenge, and they challenge it on the basis of notions of agency. So that would, of course, then be one thing I have to go to what extent can you say that an outcome is part of the action, and or that an outcome is imputable to an agent, so that it goes on the agent's ledger and is something that a rational system should be responding to. But of course, the criminal law has actually a very nuanced way in that it makes the outcomes of our intended actions relevant in a slightly different way for criminal liability than it does the outcomes of negligent actions. So the first and obvious difference is that attempts liability only pertains to intended outcomes that we fail to bring about, but not to endangered, to stuff that could have happened because we acted with great irresponsibility. So that's one difference. The other difference is more pronounced when we look at the types of crimes that are created. The outcomes of our negligent actions, even if they are as bad as the outcomes of an intended action leading to that same result, are often defined as a different crime. So the obvious example are negligent killings versus intended killings, murder versus whatever the terminology is in the given jurisdiction, but some form of negligent homicide. And in terms of the liability that attaches to these two, the differences are also vast. Or they tend to be. I think English criminal law is not always the best example for what I would want to defend in each and every detail in relation to that. But even in English criminal law, you can in principle observe there is a difference here between how much a person will be punished for negligent killing versus an intended one. And then the other feature that is part of the existing criminal law is that not all, standardly speaking, not every negligently produced outcome generates liability, but where there is liability for negligent action, it tends to hang on the occurrence of the outcome. So in the context of negligence, we have this sort of really weird pattern where on the one hand, the law says, okay, it was a negligent killing, it wasn't so bad. We won't punish it that as much as we would punish an intended killing. But on the other hand, that the outcome came about in relation to the negligence action is still the linchpin of having criminal liability at all. If it was, unless it is an often very minor regulatory violation that is committed through whatever would then count as the negligent behavior had there been the fatal event. And so this is the pattern we have. That's the pattern that has evolved. And I wanted to see how can we defend it. So in the first part of the paper, I set out to defend the idea that the result is imputable to the agent. The result goes on the agent's ledger. It is something that registers as part of the act. And in order to defend that position, I first of all draw on a sort of a broad notion of human agency, which incorporates omissions as well, omissions where you've failed to act in the sense of duty. But the broadness of the notion of action that is behind it is also illustrated by a quote from Donelli Lazaroff, where action is constituted by the unified exercise of mental and physical capacities, and they are composite of desires, reasons, motivations, knowledge, movements, foresight, evaluation, senses, and contrary to any enterprise that divorces a single physical capacity from the others and setting that up as the essence of the action. The action is to be understood via the role of these other factors in producing whatever the physical element of the action might be. And so with this broad notion of what an action is, already a sort of a socially embedded or contextualized notion of agency, we can start to think about how the result features in an action. And one can, for instance, think that intentionality, so I won't go through the actually quite simplistic examples that I used in the paper, but go straight to Pufendorf here, because that broad notion of agency is one that is historically actually very influential. It is about settling the conditions under which some happening which involves a human source qualifies as a human action. And for Pufendorf and for the philosophical tradition that followed, which is basically the whole of Western philosophy until analytical philosophy sort of got a real grip, are identical to those that make the happening in question properly subject to moral evaluation. And so what they want to identify is that what has taken place can be traced to a person as the author of that happening. So, and when these people talk about a person being a free course, they don't mean something extremely sort of complicated or sophisticated by it. They simply mean that there is a difference between an event where the human source had, in a sense, didn't have any involvement of their mind, of their choices in what was happening, but was physically forced to operate in certain ways. It was sort of, the mind was not in play, their humanity was not in play, but when their specific human capacities were in play, then this is treated as an event which originated in that person's exercise of their freedom, and therefore it has a human author. So there is a sort of a simple You might say that's too simple. We can go about we can address that in the discussion, but there is a simple match in a sense between when I take myself to be acting and when that view picks me out as a human source of an act, and therefore me having done something that originated in freedom, like now lifting, my little teacup here, taking a sip, even if things were to go wrong and I suddenly, get distracted by something in the corner and I spill my tea, that would still be something that originated in freedom because I was engaged in a project that I had chosen to perform. And so that is the first thing we want to do when we look at, bad stuff that has happened in the world. We want to see whether a particular bad thing is traceable to a human source as having been the free cause thereof. And so this is sort of that first project of imputation. And it means that, that we're in the business of, so we can in principle subject this happening to moral evaluation, which we couldn't do if that wasn't the case. And so this is then described as the first level of imputation, but that first level or that first dimension of imputation doesn't really tell us anything about whether what is imputed to the person is morally good or bad. The moral quality of this human deed only comes into focus at the second level of imputation, which concerns the question whether merit or demerit arises from this act. And interestingly here, Pufendorf distinguished between good actions, and those were actions which had good outcomes and they were not owed. Then he had actions, the performance of which is owed, and they were sort of neutral actions, and bad actions. And merit or demerit would only arise from actions that were either good in the sense of not owed, supererogatory, as some other authors would say, and on the other hand, demerit arises from actions which are bad, which are in violation of a duty, whereas no merit or demerit arises from just doing what you should be doing. So that is sort of Pufendorf's approach. And what's interesting about the connection between these two levels of imputation is that first level imputation, the identification of a happening as a human action and thus as a suitable object of moral evaluation, precedes the application of a moral law to the deed, whereas second level imputation, the judgment as to the merit or demerit of the deed, succeeds the application of the moral law. And this sequence implies that the judgment as to the merit or demerit of a deed, i.e. second level imputation, is logically different from the application of the law to that deed and its possible result, supererogation, fulfillment of duty, or violation of duty. And consequently, the supererogatory nature of an act may be a necessary but is not a sufficient condition for the assumption of merit, and an act being contrary to duty may be a necessary but is not a sufficient condition for the assumption of demerit. And it's the second point, of course, that's of interest to the criminal lawyer. So Rushka illustrates this particular, what shall I say, peculiarity with an example where he says, well, if a person, let's assume that somebody saves a swimmer's life, a swimmer is in trouble, and he saves that person's life at great risk to themselves. We would normally think they deserve to be praised for that. But what if the only reason they did that was that somebody else held a gun to their head and said, either you try and save this person now, or I shoot you dead? Then at least Rushka says we would be a little bit more hesitant about thinking, oh, this was now a very praiseworthy action. And he says the same type of phenomenon then occurs, the flip side of that we find in the criminal law, where we might have a situation where an agent is forced at gunpoint to do a very bad thing. It's also classic duress cases, but we would still think there is distance now between, there's a separate judgment to be made about whether, we still ascribe that act to the agent. It is something that is subject to moral evaluation. But when we now actually engage in that moral evaluation, we still think there is some distance between saying he did the bad thing and all the demerit that arises from having done the bad thing is imputed to him as well. In fact, we would begin to tease that apart. And so when you have that structure in place, that whatever can be subject to, that what can be subject to evaluation, to moral evaluation, is anything that originated in freedom, as understood in that tradition, any human behavior that originated in freedom. And then you take the second step that involves asking, is there enough freedom? Is that also the case for our negligent actions? And Pufendorf actually didn't write directly about negligence. I think that sort of wasn't the focus at the time. It wasn't a much debated thing amongst philosophers, but he says something that is applicable to negligence and that later philosophers, Hutcheson for instance, have applied to negligence. He says there are two ways in which something originates in freedom. One is when you do the thing itself, and the other one is when what was, well, so when what was, but what I meant with when you do the thing itself was, it was whether you do that thing or not was within the power of that individual to do or not to do. But also there are imputable actions when the cause of what you did was within your power to set or not to set. And that is then the notion that gets negligence into the game. And it is therefore quite easy to see how under that old position of imputation, negligent outcomes are part of the action because they are also things that originated in freedom in the relevant way. And so they would suggest that we impute the action plus the outcome to the agent and say that is the complex that is subject to moral evaluation here. The next interesting question, though, is it's so that is sort of that was sort of the first part of this project that I set myself to say that there is a notion of agency here that makes sense to me, that makes outcomes part of what the person is responsible for, what is subject to moral evaluation. For those outcomes where bringing about that outcome was within their power directly, or setting the course for that outcome was within their power, therefore for both intended and negligently produced outcomes. But then why should the law make all these fine distinctions that in liability patterns that I've also described at the outset? Why does it sort of then seem to take a step back when it comes to negligent outcomes and not really treat them as quite fully the responsibility of the agent? So what is going on here? And what might be going on there is something that I suggest by taking a position that Alan Bruckner has developed through his reading of Hegel in relation to something not completely different, but also not directly in relation to negligence. So Bruckner was talking about responsibility for outcomes in the context of causation, or sort of the imputation judgment in those contexts. And there he said that we actually have a different relationships to the outcome, a somewhat different relationship to the outcome of our intended actions as contrasted with the outcome of our negligent actions. And the difference lies in this. We own the outcomes of our intended actions completely, whereas we don't own the outcomes of our negligent actions completely. In some sense, part of what owns that is, fate, really. So Brudner thinks, why does he use ownership? Ownership is a sort of an analogy in that context, but he uses it by saying, well, the way Hegel thinks about ownership is that you make something your own by sort of using it, by employing it through instrumentalizing objects. They become your own, and in the sense that constitutes them as my own. Taking up this thing or taking up whatever might be lying here and using it to write constitutes the object as my pen or my writing instrument or something like that. And so it is that that mental relation that we form towards the object that is key for Hegelian type ownership. And that is the sort of idea which Brudner then says we can actually apply to the mental relation that we have to the outcomes of our actions. If we intended those, then they are fully owned by us. And he actually uses that to say that in causal doctrines, therefore, we should be more willing to ascribe an outcome to an agent, even when the outcome was extremely implausible. So he has the example of a sort of a basket, or what do they play in America all the time? Baseball. So anyway, they play this game where the ball has to go into a net, all right? High up net. And somebody takes a shot that is really super, super difficult, but of course they want to get the ball in, and then they get the ball in. And so that is sort of something where Brudner then says, that because it's intended, that's kind of sort of gives it the extra attribution edge. It means that the person is, they own their goal in a sense. However, when something happens through your negligence, then in a sense, you don't completely own the outcome. It is attributable to you, but it is partly also owned by, or not owned by anyone in a sense, it's partly attributable to all the bad things you didn't have, all the contextual things you didn't have any control over and you didn't have on your radar screen. And so that, I thought, was an idea that I can then develop further to actually explain why what happens in the criminal law in relation to negligence. In that I pulled these two theories together. The first one that said you are responsible for the outcomes of your negligence because they are part of your action. You set the course, the cause for what happened here was originated in your freedom, but at the same time, you shouldn't be held. So on the second level of imputation, the merit-demerit imputation, you shouldn't be held fully responsible for the negligent outcome because there was still a sense in which you can say, that wasn't me. That's not me. Completely, that I don't own this outcome fully in a sense. And that could then explain why the criminal law punishes less for negligence and systematically so much less for negligence than for bringing about the same outcome with intent, and why, on the other hand, it makes the occurrence of the negligence outcome the linchpin of liability, in that without the outcome, you probably don't have anything in place. Just the negligent behavior in itself would not attract sufficient demerit. It might not even be in violation of duty. Okay, so that's sort of the remapping of the criminal law in the paper, and I'm open to questions about it.